Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the International African American Museum Center for Family History monthly webinar. Today, our topic is telling and writing your stories. Next. Let's have a little bit of Charleston trivia. Some of you have heard this before, but we just want to make sure you are reminded of what we have to offer. So here we go. What is the size of a football field and a half? What was located at Gadsden's Wharf? What has 9 galleries? Who has a Center for Family History that will provide educational programs for visitors, both young and old? Also, who has membership opportunities? For any of these answers, if you didn't put any in the chat, you can find them at the main website of https://iaamuseum.org and look under events or just look at the whole website and enjoy. So we are in webinar mode. Want to tell you a little bit about the Center for Family History. As you can see on the screen, there's an overview on the website. It'll tell you about the Resource Center, the digital archives, and also ways to contribute. We also offer one-on-one genealogy consultations. So for more information, visit the website. Got a few reminders. The session is being recorded and will be available at a later date. Please keep yourself muted and turn off your video during the presentation or discussion. Closed caption is available. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Questions will get responded to after the panelist discussion. So let's welcome our guest. We have one more slide to share. And we're going to have up on my corner, should be one, there you go. Welcome to our guest. And by the way, my name is Shelley Murphy, and I also have Brian Sheffield live at the museum. Wave, Brian, so people know where you're at. Thank you. He is the director of the Center for Family History. So again, let's welcome our guest. We've got Miss Donya Williams, and she's going to mention some things about Comes to the Light, learning about entangled families of Edgefield, South Carolina. We've got Darius Brown. He is a resident research assistant at the Center for Family History, and his book, At the Feet of the Elders, A Journey into a Low Country Family History. And then we have Bernice Alexander Bennett. Yes, I added your middle name in there. And our ancestors and our stories. And again, we want to thank you. We want to welcome you. And what we'll do is have some round robin type questions. And then Bernice is going to share some slides towards the end. And then we'll have our Q&A. Okay, is everybody ready? All right. Miss Donya, this is actually a question that's going to go to all three of you. So what initially drew you to explore your family's history, and how do you feel when you first discovered stories of slavery or Black topics that affect you today? So tell us how you got started about this. Your book.
I got started because my grandfather's last name is very rare. So I originally was just looking for the descendants of my grandparents. And I ended up finding out that there were over 400 after I did my count that was still living. So Once I did the living, I ended up doing the dead. And I was just started to dig backwards and learning about my grandfather. It took me I started in 1996, and it took me about to 2007 before I finally found him as a kid. And it was because his name was spelled different, his last name was different, everything was, so that's, I immediately started learning about the name differences. Edgefield, South Carolina, if y'all watch our show and everything, it's a whole monster in itself. And so you become an expert through Edgefield.
And you mentioned if you watch your show, tell us the name of your show that you co-host with Brian Sheffy.
The name of our show is Genealogy Adventures, and we host it together every Sunday at 4 p.m. And we talk about Eastern time, and we talk about research in every way, but we also talk about how today's world coincides with the past. And you asked that as a part of your question, you asked me how, the things that I found now and how it links, and it links crazy. It's crazy how my family is very political, always has been. And I didn't know that. I knew that my people were my aunts and uncles and my grandfather and all them, but I didn't realize until I did my research that it actually goes back in history. So we actually go back to Preston Brooks, who ends up being like my great grand uncle, and that was the man that beat Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. So we've had, and when I look at my research and I look at my family, we've had at least one person in politics, whether it be local, state, or federal government, every generation.
Fascinating. And again, we have to tell these stories.
Yes.
So
yes.
I'm going to Darius Brown, new author, research assistant at the International African American Museum Center for Family History. Same question. What initially drew you to explore your family history? Because I also know you tapped into military, you tapped into several things with your book. So go ahead. Let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so the way I got started back in 2017, I saw an Ancestry commercial. So I started with 23andMe. I took that DNA test, and it said I was 96% African. So I was like, hey, maybe this is a fluke because why is it so high? So I said, I'm going to take family tree DNA. That said 97%. Then I took Ancestry.com. That said 98%, 98% African. So I said, well, there's something to this, and maybe I can research my family all the way back to Africa. That was my initial goal, like being like overly optimistic. And so taking DNA tests is actually what got me started researching my family history. But I had always heard stuff about my family growing up from like my elders and stuff. My great grandfather, he was like so knowledgeable, and everything that he talked about was always in the past, like nothing contemporary. You know, he always talking about, yeah, my granddad did this, and he was a sergeant in the Civil War. So DNA testing and oral history is what really got me interested, because the oral history that was passed down was interesting, you know, to hear my elders talk about that and give the names of slave owners and, you know, then the full name, first, middle, and last name. And so you can tell that it was like passed down and it meant something to us. And so I felt that I had to be the person to do more research and, you know, possibly confirm, you know, what was passed down.
So it fell on your shoulders. And I'm going to say this, you're probably the first person, African-American first person that I know that has 96, 97% African ancestry.
Well, I have an uncle who's 100%. I have an uncle who's 100%.
Unbelievable. I have DNA matches to 2 African that are that in their native country, but not someone in this country. So kudos to you. I'll say that. So now, Miss Bennett, all right. What initially drew you to explore your family history? And I know we have known each other over 20 years now. So this is exciting to see what you have been going through and have done. And especially with this book, Our Ancestors, you know, and our family, our memories and things like that. That really was motivational. So tell us about what drew you to get started in exploring your family.
Well, one thing I'd like to say to everyone is that my Southern roots run deep. I grew up in Louisiana. I'm from New Orleans. And so that's my maternal line, because my mom is from New Orleans. And my father's line is from South Carolina. And so I grew up all around the Louisiana folks. My grandmother lived to be almost 106. That's my maternal grandmother. However, my paternal grandmother lived to be 32, which meant that she passed away in 1928. However, there was a portrait of her. In fact, that side of the family left a lot of pictures. On my maternal line, I knew great aunts. We had family reunions. We knew each other. And it was just one of those things about growing up in Louisiana. There's a whole cultural thing about growing up in New Orleans, but we definitely got together and shared a lot. South Carolina was another thing. I didn't know that much about South Carolina and really didn't know many relatives. And so my journey was designed for me to find living relatives. I really wasn't searching for the dead. I was searching for the living. And my father was from 96, South Carolina. And so I set out to find everything I could about my paternal line. And that paternal line led me to discover cousins I didn't know existed. Also, it led me to find out more about my grandmother's family, to the point where I did connect with the descendant of the enslaver of my great grandfather. Of course, now I have even more, just tons of family members and tons of information about Edgefield, South Carolina, a community of which Donya and I share a large number of ancestral roots and ancestral stories. And actually, that's how I connected with Donya, because we have ancestors from the same community.
We're family.
What was that, Donya?
She probably said there's family here.
Oh, I'm sure. Okay. So moving on to the next question, because all of this is fascinating for me. So we know it's not that easy conducting research for African ancestry. So will each of you, and I'll go back to Donya, will you share some of the challenges that you faced, while you were researching your family's past, especially if you crossed past that 1870 census brick wall, as some people will note?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. All right. So, well, I actually got to it very quickly because I'm not ashamed of my age. I'm 52 years old.
Congratulations.
I have old grandparents. My grandparents were born in the 1890s. So I'm actually somebody who have great grandparents who were born if not during slavery, definitely at the very cusp of the ending of slavery. So I jumped into slavery real quick in my research. And the first person that I found was my great grandmother, Martha Brooks. And she was the one that really kind of introduced me to everything. But the problem with me was I had already set my mind to be like, whatever I found, I was going to accept it. I wasn't going to let myself, I wasn't going to let it bother me. I wasn't going to let it get to me like some people allow it to do. And I think I did that so well that my ancestor got mad at me and was like, no, I'm gonna need you to find this. And now I want you to go look at this. And now I want you to go look at this. And Martha Brooks, made me realize, hey, you can separate your feelings, but I still need you to feel it.
Yes.
And at first I wasn't feeling anything. I went as deep as to learning that she was a breeder. And I didn't feel anything. I was like, okay, I just made myself accept everything that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But then when she started introducing me to different things like the what are they called? The pretty ladies, I think they call them. Fancy
ladies.
Fancy ladies.
Yeah, the fancy ladies. I read about that, and I read about how they separated what they called a prime woman and a prime man. And I realized that she was actually worth what a prime man was worth.
Mm.
So her worth was very, very wide. And then when we got into the DNA, and my mom, Bernice, can remember this, they were calling my mother Eve because she was just matching everybody.
Oh, wow.
And now we're at the point where there's a reason why she's matching everybody, because she's literally related and connected to everyone. And then this whole breeding thing, we didn't even know that there are more kids out there that Martha may have had. And it's some of those children that have popped up on the DNA, and we had no clue. So at the beginning, I felt nothing, but now I feel everything.
So writing your book, you had your ancestor Martha Brooks as your guide then.
All of them people was my guide. They got on my nerves. Yeah.
I have heard and I have heard this before, and I'm sure there's people in the audience that can attest the same thing, that their ancestors guide them on this journey.
Oh,
and
my God.
Also
yes.
the panelists here. So I'm going to turn to Darius. Were there challenges that you faced in the research as well as the journey of writing the book?
Yeah, so to the research part, the challenges was my hometown is a burn county. And I learned that very early in researching. The person who got me started, she told me that, but I was just starting off, and I didn't know what a burn county meant at that time. It was like very.
So you
early.
Want to share?
Yeah. So a burn county just means that the records in that county suffered record laws. And Beaufort records were burned during the Civil War when Sherman went through Columbia, and we sent our records to Columbia for safekeeping. And they never returned. So everything before 1865 doesn't exist anymore. And it was challenging, but it made me a good researcher because it made me turn over every stone. And so I found ways and loopholes researching in Charleston records and stuff like that, trying to find my family in slavery. And so that was like some of the early challenges, along with my community being extremely endogamous. And so I'm related to some people 5 and 6 times, and I'm trying to figure out which segments of DNA come from which ancestor, and so it's a blessing and cursing at the same time. Being related to everyone.
Sure.
Yeah, and so those were some of the challenges.
Okay.
But when it came to the writing part, I didn't really experience challenges. I guess you can say the challenges I had was worrying about doing the editing part in the beginning, worrying about stuff like that. But that, I should have been worrying about that later on, worrying about editing and stuff like that. So I'm trying to make it the end product in the beginning. And so that's the challenge that I always had being a first time writer, worrying about how the book is going to turn out. But, I will always say, just start writing. Don't worry about that stuff.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
You think about that later.
Absolutely. Bernice, challenges. And I'm referencing the collaborative book, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. But what were some of the challenges you faced while researching your family's past and linking to a book or even a different book? Just bring whichever one you want.
I just want to start off by saying that I'm very systematic in the way that I approach my family history. And having the name of a place of the only child, which my father was the only child, and never visiting that place, I had to first start off learning about where he came from. studying the home place, understanding where 96 South Carolina was located, understanding the bigger picture of the old Edgefield district. So I had to study that. I studied books and talked to historians just to learn about that community. Darius mentioned that he came from his place was a burn county. Well, the old Edgefield district did not burn, which meant that we had original records there. And because I said I'm very systematic, I do believe in connecting with people at the home place. And so I did reach out to the old Edgefield District Genealogical Society. I'm one of those people. I really believe that if you're going to do genealogy, you need to connect with people that know how to do genealogy. So that was kind of my one kind of starting place. Not to mention that I've joined the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. Joined it because I connected with other people who knew what they were doing. So education is extremely important. The next part of this is that there's a group of people that were a part of Afrogenius. And Afrogenius, and this is, I told you I was looking for the living.
Yes.
Afrogenius had a sheet. I don't even know if you call it a sheet, but they had a surname sheet. Yeah. And if you're looking for somebody, the one place that you could do is put your name and the location, and that would help you. So I thought maybe that would jumpstart my research by going to Afrogenius and studying the resources they had available. And that is where I found somebody looking for the same surname in the same location that I was searching. And then I had the missing information. I had no idea that my grandmother had a brother.
Wow.
So when you start doing this research, you find family secrets, you find stuff that you don't expect to find. I had no idea. And because this person reached out and we talked, and she identified her grandfather and his mother and father, well, what did I do? I went to my grandmother's two sisters and I looked at information to see if I could verify the same mother and father. And I did. And then I looked at my grandmother's death certificate, same mother and father. So that was the beginning of me connecting with the living. And from there, we continued the journey of looking and talking and gathering information. Now, my office was right down the street from the National Archives. I'm the old-fashioned genealogist. I didn't have Ancestry.com. I had the National Archives. So I would go into the National Archives and do the sound decks. Remember the old way? And you get the microfilm and scroll through the microfilm and find what you're looking for. Well, that's how I got my beginning. And Donya, I'm not going to tell folks how old I am, but I could tell you.
But we're going to say congratulations, whatever you held today. You know, we're glad to have you here. Now, each of you have gave some great points about looking at challenges and getting started and things like that. Number one, you got a guide, be it the ancestor guiding you or other family members. Number two, listening to those family members is number two. You got to take what you hear. They could be the hints, you know, or they could be the leads to your next finding or a way to resolve something that doesn't sound right or something that's conflicting. And then Bernice, you bring up about the interaction with genealogy groups and going where other people are doing the research. So it's almost like a network. So you're saying build the network. And you mentioned Afrogenius. I am a true follower of afrogenius.com. The website is still up as far as I know, but there's an active Facebook page with probably over 10,000 people interacting. I miss the forums that they used to have, or lunch on Tuesday and so forth. So again, but that resource is still there. And one thing before I go to the next question, on their website, they used to have a resource of getting started with genealogy, slide by slide. So again, an excellent resource out there. So for the next question, and this is about the historical context and accuracy. And Bernice, you led to a little bit, so I'll start with you first. When you're doing research for writing the stories on your ancestors and conducting this genealogical research, how do you ensure that your historical accuracy of the narratives that you're finding, or especially when we're crossing in the slave era, how do you ensure that what you're finding is accurate? We're using online, looking at documents, but documents could be incorrect. And the first thing that comes to mind is the population census. Those early years, you don't know who gave that information. It could have been the kid next door. So how do you ensure the information, and this is going to come to all of you, what is one of the things that you did to make sure the information was accurate that you're putting out there, either for your book or on your family tree? Bernice?
Well, one of the things, and I want to go back to the verification process that I did, just verifying the mother and father of my grandmother. I went to several different sources. I didn't accept one. I went to Social Security application of my grandmother's sister. I went to the marriage record of another sister. I looked at my grandmother's death certificate and looked at the informant. Who was the informant? Mm-hmm. And then I looked at the death certificate that was presented to me of my grandmother's brother. Mm-hmm. And with that, I validated all of the information that I had obtained and then concluded that I had the right information. The same thing I would do with a newspaper article. I would look at dates. I would look at location and make sure that I'm getting the right person.
Sure.
For example, my grandfather is named William Alexander. My grandfather has an uncle named William Alexander. Now, I know that one was born in 1868 and the other was born in 1888. The one born in 1888 is my grandfather.
Yeah.
But if you just look at the name and not verify other information, you could have erroneous information showing up in your tree. So I'm really into validating the information by looking at several sources. And then I document every source that I use when I am telling the story.
Okay, thank you. Donya.
So there was a couple of things. First off, I love math. And I started to look at genealogy like geometry. You know, when you're solving geometry, you have to solve an angle, you have to prove it. You have to have your hypothesis. You have to have which way it's going to go. You know, my thought process is this person is this who this is, and I have to show proof of that person. So I kind of compared geometry to genealogy, and that was one of my ways of really learning how to break my proofs up and finding what I needed to do. The second thing was what was a part of my proofs. Well, people like Bernice. Bernice was one of my mentors when I first started. A lot of people don't know that, but she was. She was one of the people that I first came across, her and a few other names. And I love these ladies. As far as I'm concerned, I know what I know because of them. And I continue to hone into what I know because of them. So there was one moment with Martha, for example. Bernice really made me dig into Martha because she wanted me to make sure that Martha was a breeder. So how did I make sure Martha was a breeder? She gave me an opposite book that told me how breeding actually may not have existed. And I read on it. And then I turned around and I did other research and I started learning all of these different things. So the stuff that I learned from my mentors, take your mentors in because they will help you. They will guide you. They're not going to give you the wrong information. They're not going to tell you anything wrong because their names rest on it. Yes. Especially when we talk as much as we do. And we have such a small community of African-American genealogists. Just earlier today, I just referred Bernice to somebody. I'll talk to you about that later. But I did. I just referred Bernice to somebody just earlier today. And we have that small community. So we have to be knowledgeable and be trusting of our community. How many times have I come to you, Shelly? Right.
Last week?
Last week? Okay. But yes, I mean, yes. I utilize those genealogists who have more experience than I do. And even though my experience is 30 years deep, so what? So look at y'all. You guys are there for me, and I can always count on y'all to do that. The third thing that I used to help verify my stuff was obituaries. Obituaries are such a good reference. They literally break down who the children really are. Like all day long, you can have somebody in there saying, oh yeah, that's my mama, that's my mama, that's my mama. But then as soon as you get to that obituary, you find out, oh, that really wasn't their mama. Who is this kid? And you start moving it around and you start seeing, oh, well, this child was really this person's child. That was just her stepkid. And so it was obituaries, my mentors, and me just listening to the research and what it was that I was finding and the questions that was asked to me by my research, my mentors that allowed me to say, okay, let me go look this way. I don't know if Bernice knows how much of an impact that she has on me. I really don't. I didn't think you did, but it's 5 women that had a serious impact on my research, and I praise them as often as possible.
And I will ditto that. You do.
I do. I praise them as often as possible. And
whoop, you just went mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I stay humble in my research because I know that it's always something more to learn with it. So, and I know I got that from Bernice and you and Sheila and Nathan. You know, I got that from those ladies, and Candace. It's you guys that really, you are my research.
Well, I'm gonna make a comment before I turn this to Darius. You have to also understand you're calling us mentors, but as you question and your issues come, we are also learning from you and from your situation, which helps us in ours. So we can turn, and I hope Bernice agrees with me, because your challenges also build our strengths. And that could be, Brian could say that, Bernice, I can say Angela, call everybody out. We learn just as much from people bringing stuff and questioning us. And that helps us even be better to help somebody else. So kudos to all of us that are networking in this arena of genealogy. So Darius, how did you ensure accuracy? I'm thinking of your U.S. colored troops. 14, 15 of them, I might even have that wrong. How did you ensure that what you were finding was accurate? And you've heard what the ladies have said here. What can you add to that?
I don't know what to add. They done took everything.
I'm gonna ditto with that, but I know there's more. There's more.
So from the beginning, I was always taught, does it meet genealogical proof standard?
There you go.
That's what I was always taught. So the person that got me started, Kimberly Morgan, she reached out to me after I joined the Facebook group for genealogy. And it was funny because we were actually neighbors. She lived down the road from me. And so, she took me under her wing and she was like teaching me, about genealogical proof standard. But with me, you always have to have multiple lines of evidence, not just relying on one piece of evidence. For the same reason that they talked about earlier. You might see one census and it's saying that this is this person's daughter, and then you find an obituary and it says, well, that's really that person's niece. And so you want to have multiple lines of evidence, and you want to make sure that you don't have any conflicting information. If you do have conflicting information, then you have to figure out, well, why is it conflicting? And so for me, that's the route I always took. Having multiple lines of evidence. And because DNA was so crucial a part of my research, I always wanted to confirm something through DNA matches. Could I confirm that these two ancestors are really my ancestors? Can I find some other descendants of my direct ancestors? Maybe their siblings took ancestry.com. Can I find these people on my DNA matches? Because ultimately it would mean that we inherited the same segments of DNA because they came from the same common ancestor. And so once I did the exhaustive research, finding the paper documents, then I would say, well, let's go to the DNA evidence. Can I find evidence that, I still share DNA with these people, with my ancestors, living descendants, somewhere else? And so those were some of the ways that I made sure that I was putting out, accurate information and making sure that you cite your information. Citations is very big for me because when I was doing the research, many times I would buy books and go straight to the primary sources so that, I can find where they got the information from. And it's the same thing with me. I got my primary sources in the back of the book so you can verify if what I'm saying is correct. And so that was some of the ways that
excellent points. Yeah. All of y'all brought this home. This is excellent. So who wants to take this one on? It could be all of you or just one or two of you. What was in this journey of writing these books and telling these stories, what was the most surprising or impactful discovery that you made during that journey of doing the research for your books? Who just go for it. Whoever, go on, Bernice. You came out. I saw.
Well, I made several discoveries, but one discovery was very sad, and it was consistent with the family story that my grandmother did not grow up with her parents, and I discovered why, and it was a family secret. Her father was murdered.
Oh.
And I discovered this through a newspaper headline. Richard Kemp killed by law-abiding citizen John Livingston. And that was in the newspaper in 1907. And I did reach out to cousins that would have known the story. And was told prior to me finding out what happened, that what happened a long time ago and I should leave it alone. And they never told me what it was. On finding this information, I called the individual back and I said, I found out what happened. And I think by me telling her, it kind of released the burden of the secret, because after I shared that information, I also received a picture of my grandmother and her sister. On the back of the picture, it was dated 1908 with her name, and that she was the nieces of this person's grandfather. So, when you start searching, you are going to encounter a lot of things.
Yeah.
The other, of course, was finding that my ancestor was enslaved. and connecting with the descendant of the enslaver who knew who we were before we knew who she was, because we had all of the information back to the 1870 census, and she had seen all of our information before. She knew who we were.
And if I remember right, your ancestors who were enslaved, weren't they owned by the governor of South Carolina?
That's another set. Yes,
okay.
They were owned by, this is more research, but my ancestors were owned by Andrew Pickens Jr. and then by the son, Francis Wilkerson Pickens. Yes.
Okay.
And I have the plantation. I have all the proof. Yes.
All right, Donya. What was surprising?
Well, the surprising thing was finding out that I was related to Preston Brooks. That literally blew my mind.
Now, I don't want you to leave out mentioning Mr. Moses Williams either.
I won't. Okay.
Yeah, I remember.
Okay. All right. So
don't leave him out.
The most surprising, but I will have to say the most surprising. Okay, Moses is the second surprising thing, but the most surprising thing was definitely finding out my connection to Preston Brooks, and I think it was like that because I'd seen the caning picture in school, and I remember doing the research, but they never told us his name. They only told us the abolitionist name, which was Charles Sumner. So they never went into detail about the man that actually did the beating on him in school. And so when I found that picture, it was so funny because when we talk about the ancestors and their guiding and things of that nature, that was one of the things that Martha was like, okay, sis, I need you to start feeling this stuff, and this is what I need you to do. And he was the second owner. His father was the first owner, and then Lemuel Brooks was the third owner of her. She was always with the Brooks line. But for some reason, I went straight to the middle when I did my research. I didn't start from the beginning or at the end. I went to the middle because I was guided to go to Preston, look at Preston. And when I did that and I saw that picture, and I'm like, wait a minute, this was in my history book. Hold on. What? So, Black children don't think they learn about themselves
right
when they're in history. But I sat there and I found out that I was actually learning something of my history in school, and I didn't know it. So that was probably, I will give that was one of the biggest things that I found. The second biggest thing was Mr. Moses. Moses Williams was born.
I love Moses.
Moses Williams. Brian loves it too. That's why he's sitting there laughing, because Brian made me do Moses. I didn't want to research Moses. That was one that I was
He's
like,
South Carolina too, correct?
Everybody is Edgefield. Well,
Okay.
He was born in Virginia, and his migration pattern was Virginia, North Carolina, finally ending up in South Carolina. And Moses was born before the American Revolution, so before America was America, and he died 20 years after the Civil War ended. So he's an amazing man.
Yeah.
He's seen every war. He's seen the changing from skirts to pantaloons. He's seen the changing of how money was.
Y'all hear her telling this story, right? Y'all hear
he is the last. He is the last connection. And it's, even though it's not written, but I'm working on it, he is the last connection to the American Revolutionary War. They have one other guy who was listed that died like, what was it, Brown, 105 years old, well before Moses. But Moses was actually the last person to die when it came to the American Revolution. So we're working on that. We're going to get that done to make sure people understand and recognize who he is. But the biggest story about Moses is that he had 45 children.
Yes.
40 girls, 5 boys, 20 girls, 2 boys with one woman, 20 girls, 3 boys with another. And my mom is a descendant of confirmed 3 of his children, 2 daughters, 1 son. So that's why she's Eve.
Tell that story. You got to tell that story. The significance of that. This is what we're talking about. You guys are walking through who's guiding you. And these stories count because if we don't tell them, it's not known.
Okay, so Moses came about because my mom's great grandfather's name is Moses.
Okay.
And I was looking through the newspapers and trying to find some more information about him because he was born in like 1791. So he was also born after the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And he was born after the American Revolution, but he was born in 1791. So I was like, well, let me see if I can find some information about him and whatever. And then I get to this article about a man named Moses Williams and how he looked 50, but he was actually 65, and that he had 45 children, 20 girls, 2 boys with one.
Did you yell?
Well, I didn't yell because I had told Brian off the break. I was like, I'm not researching this guy. This is not happening. It's maybe my Moses, but I'm not doing it. Because I'm still stuck on the 1791 Moses. And I shared it with Brian, and I told him then, I was like, hey, I think I found Moses Jr., but let me let you know, I'm not doing it. That's what I told him. I was like, yeah, we're not doing this today. We're not doing this. And he was like, okay. But it's a lot. This man had a lot of kids. I'm not doing it. So Brian gets it. And then Brian turns around and finds his obituary note. Oh. He died October 7th, 1884, and 43 of his children were still living. So he shared that with me, and I was like, he was 115 years old. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, the math not mathing. 1791 don't come to 115 when this was done in 1884. I was like, Brian, this not him. He said, no, that's his dad. I was like, nah, Slim, I'm not doing this.
You're not doing it, but I'm telling you, this is when you get guided to tell that story right there.
So then we started a group, and Sheila Hightower, Sharon Klontz, is that how we pronounce her name? Sharon Klontz, Brian and myself, and Loretta Bellamy and Hamad Hassad, we all kind of got together and we started doing the research. And as of right now, I think we're at 25 children.
Okay.
We're at 25 children. Yeah. And all of the kids were born into slavery. And we found 25 of them. And out of those 25 kids, every last one of them had 10 or more children.
Oh, Lord.
So this man is looking at definitely being the grandfather of 450, the great grandfather of 4,500, the great, and so on and so forth. I can say for me, where from one of my mother's lines, from Violet Williams had 10, and then she had a kid that had 12, and then my great grandmother had 10, and then my grandmother had 14. That's just giving you how many people. This man had cities. But he doesn't have he don't have just a small. He's the reason. He's just the overall reason for most of my connections, and probably the reason why most of Edgefield, if not all of Edgefield, is related.
I was going to say that would make that community connected. Yeah. Which is another good point, is to start looking at community, not just your person in the community. Right. Look at the whole community. And I'm going to turn this to Darius, because family is not far from family. You can have a few that go off, but the majority of folks are going to be grounded. And you mentioned like Buford and this, that, and other. So for you, what was one of the most surprising things that you learned about on the journey writing your book?
So what I would say is one of the most surprising things, and I'm just going to mention it briefly because I always talk about it, is the amount of ancestors that I have that served in the Civil War.
Absolutely.
But another thing was,
well, how many?
It's close to 30. and it's still counting. So
Amen.
it's 7 direct ancestors, and the rest are uncles and cousins. Um, but something else that was very, I guess you can say, intriguing was my family was passed down for several generations in many of these enslaving families. And it's kind of eye-opening because you really seeing people being reduced to property. And you read about it, in school, hey, slavery happened, chattel slavery, these people were considered property. But to actually see the documents, that was like changing for me. And so I have a branch of my family that has been inside South Carolina since the early 1700s. The reason why I know that is because the Pinckney family, they were one of the prominent families from Charleston. Their descendants decided to donate their ancestor records to several universities from the late 1600s all the way up until like the late 1990s or 2000s. So they have letters and plantation journals and slave lists and all that stuff. And my family was recorded in several of the plantation journals for 6 generations. To my 8th great grandparents, Isaac and Molly and John and Helena, all the way down to my 3rd great grandfather. He was the last generation to be enslaved by the Pinckneys. And then they were sold to another slave owner in Beaufort, and I have the bill of sale for that. But it's really sad to see that they experienced that trauma for generation to generation to generation to generation, just accumulating all that wealth for this family. And it's somewhat funny because this week I actually met a descendant of that family inside the Center for Family History.
Wow.
He was a direct descendant of that slave owner family from Charleston. And I showed him the documents of my family and, how they were owned by his family. And he was somewhat speechless because he didn't know what to say. But, it was that happened that day.
Yeah. And it was time for that to come around. Things come when people are ready to receive that information. And that's, just the belief that I have, you're ready to accept. Because when we embark on this journey, it's going to be emotional. And I know, and to side remark, Bernice does this excellent, talk on the emotional things around DNA and doing research and things like that. People have to prepare themselves, just as you are preparing to write these books. So the next question, and we're doing good, y'all, on time. So for the next question, you writing the stories and as you're gathering information, how do you pick and choose what stays in and what doesn't as far as going in the book? Because you make decisions, then you could have an editor that comes behind you. But for you telling your family's story, how do you decide what to include or what to leave out? And did you set goals on what you're trying to tell about the story, be it to the open public, or is it stories that just go to the family? And so I'm going to come right back to you, Darius, and let you start this one off. How did you pick and choose what's in there? Or did you just put everything in there and let it flow?
So with me, the way that I wanted to structure my book was around the Battle of Port Royal.
Okay.
And the Battle of Port Royal took place in November of 1861. And I wanted to be centered around that because many African Americans in the Low Country don't know that it was African Americans who were freed that early in 1861. And so I have it centered around that because that's how my family obtained the land that we still live on now. They purchased it in the 1860s. And so I want to show my family experiences during slavery, how they were freed from slavery, and then the communities that they formed right afterwards. And so that kind of was the thought process that I had. And I guess you could say that I did put everything in, everything I researched in the book because I wanted to go all out. You know, I was writing my heart out with that book.
Okay. Yeah. All right, Bernice.
Okay, so my story had a theme, and the theme was centered around searching for my South Carolina kin. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted folks to understand the journey that I went through and what motivated me. Mm-hmm. And I think I mentioned earlier that I had a portrait of my grandmother, and I had that portrait restored. And I felt that it was very important for me to make her my center. Got it. And making her my center also was motivated by the fact that I was told by my father, my grandfather, my father's cousins that my twin sister and I looked just like my grandmother. Can you imagine being told something like this about somebody that you never met? And it was time for me to put what they call meat on the bones and to study what I could about her so that I can then have this story to share with my family and with my community. And the journey itself brought me to a whole community of Edgefield, South Carolina, a community of Black genealogists looking to do the same thing. Right. And so it was part of this, Our Ancestors, Our Stories is a part of a community story with different people sharing their stories. So that was what got me going. And yes, I started from my beginning and I stopped at a place where I felt I had said what I wanted to say. Of course, it didn't stop my research. It just stopped that journey with that one family.
And we'll come back to that in a moment because you have some slides you want to share. So Donya, you were on, your book focuses on you really getting started in learning this because you had just embarked on doing this research. And that's what I found. What was exciting was when I read your book was the fact that I understood the questions you were asking. So again, how did you pick and choose what you wanted to say in that book and on your book?
It wasn't more so of a pick and choose thing. It was just an order thing for me.
Okay. Good tip.
Because all of this stuff I had already found years ago, but I had to make it in my book. I had to give it some type of chronological order to who it was that I was talking about and where my discussions were coming in at. Again, with my book, when I first started writing my book, chapter 1 wasn't even there.
Right.
Brian made me write chapter 1. So yeah, I didn't even have chapter 1 there. Chapter 1 wasn't there. And he was like, it's missing something. And I said, well, what is it missing? What? Because I was telling just the stories that I knew, because my book was a family book. So I never submitted it to anything. I never tried to put it in any awards. It was just a book for my family to actually learn and know who my grandparents were. I mean, I realized that my mom didn't even know she had an uncle named Charles, and she thought she knew everything about her mother's side. And I said, well, what about your Uncle Charles? And she was like, who is that? So, you know, it was just really just a book to allow my family to learn, hey, these are the people that are actually connected to Annie Mae Sr. and Jefferson Davis Yildale, and this is who they are. These are who they come from. And it turned into this whole monster of people where my mom's DNA ended up connecting at that time to over 200 folks, and 200 surnames was being pulled in. And it just came to this whole monster book and this whole monster thing about my mother just becoming Eve. Like if I was to rewrite the book, it would probably call Becoming Eve, because she was Eve in this whole story. But my overall, I think mine was more of a doing it chronologically, trying to make people understand, where my journey started, which was starting with the living people and now transferring to the dead, and giving the stories of my aunts and how they, some of them I was a little bit scared of, to say something, to ask a question or whatever, because I didn't know how she was going to respond, or, because she was the reason. My Aunt Lula ended up by herself, almost 100 people, just by herself, just her. That's it. So that was a part of it. That was what my thing was. My book was more so, I put everything in. I put everything that I knew at that time.
Right.
Everything that I found. But now I've probably enhanced every story that's in there. Like Bernice said, the journey didn't stop. The research didn't stop. Every story in there has been enhanced. Probably one of my favorite stories in there is not Moses, is actually John Yeldale. John Yeldale ended up changing his name like he was going through the Underground Railroad after Civil War ended. And he ended up, it's a story. That's all I can say about that one.
Well, and I think all of you have shared good points, because people are thinking about doing this. We all want to share or tell a story, and something that we want to hear the successes, of course, but we also want to hear those challenges and also those experiences. And so I want to turn this to Bernice for a moment. And Brian, if you'll bring up her slides. Bernice, that book that you did about our ancestors, our story, and I'm saying this because Darius and Donya did individual books where you had a book with other authors. So I don't want to go away today without you sharing some tips about working with other either family members or another co-author. So I'll let you go from there. We just have a couple slides to go, and then we got one more question, and then we will conclude. So Bernice?
Right. So I mentioned community. And I think Darius talked about the community also. And so what happened with a group of us is that we were sharing our stories with each other. And an individual by the name of Anita Paul Henderson said to me one time, you should write a book. And you don't have to do it by yourself. Why don't you get other people to join forces with you and you write your book? And so because there were this wonderful community of researchers, we decided we would collaborate to tell our story, so that you can see that we chose to call ourselves the Memory Keepers. And with that, each of us had a chapter to write in the book. It would be our story about our ancestors. But there's several things that we had to do. We first had to commit to each other that we would write and share this story. We also had to share the cost. Writing a book is not something that you do and it's free. Simply because you have to have an editor, you have to have a publisher, you have to have a formatter, you have to have other people to work with you. And so as co-authors, we had to share the costs and invest in the process, the project. We also had to write. And so we came up with this agreement that we would each write a 5,000 word essay. And that with that 5,000 word essay, that we would each put so many pictures in our essay. And then we had deadlines that we had to meet. And when you look at this and you start talking about, well, what are you going to do and how are you going to do it? We started that whole process of writing and sharing our stories. And let me just tell you something about these pictures at the bottom. These are our grandparents. And so when the cover was designed, the cover took into consideration that we were also talking about people and honoring our family. We also reached out to renowned historian Dr. Arville Vernon Burton. He was the author of In Our Father's House There Are Many Mansions, and he wrote a lot about Edgeville. We also had a historian, Harris Bailey Jr., to put everything into context so that folks would understand what this book was all about. So would you go to the next page? Next slide. Okay, so this is just the structure of the book. So you could see we had a foreword, we had an introduction so people understood who we were and what we were doing. Then we broke it down when I said chapters. Harris Bailey Jr. talked about this place known as Edgeville. Ethel Daly talked about the journey has just begun. And as I said, I was talking about finding my South Carolina kin. Ellen Levon Butler, a journey to find my Butler ancestors. And then Vincent Shepard on behalf of the ancestral spirits. And then we ended with an epilogue and endnotes and an index. And these are the collaborators. All of our names are on this book. All of us are authors. And here we are celebrating that we received an award from the Afro-American Historical Society. This is something that everybody could do. Find a group of people with a common interest, focus the theme on that common interest, collaborate, make the decision that you're going to write that story, and then do it. But I also have other types of stories you want to consider. So could you go to the next slide? This is another story of which I chose to self-publish. The other story was self-published, but there were collaborators, which means that we all put money into the collaboration of that book. This is a book that I chose to write without any collaborators, but to focus on, again, a journey to find land based on a story that my grandmother told me her grandfather owned a lot of land. And so I also went through this whole journey, waking up at 5 o'clock every morning, meditating, and just writing. There's something about writing, folks, that I want to say to you all. You can write and you can go back and you can keep writing, or you can just write until you've exhausted all of what you have to say. Then you go back and then you edit, because your first draft is never good. You may think it's good, but it's never good. But this is what that book looked like. And I was so happy to get an award, several awards for this particular book. And it won first place with the Next Generation Indie Award. But this was my way of writing a story that all of my Louisiana kin folks would be proud of. And I reached out to an author, and he gave me permission to use, this is Ellis. Ted Ellis, and he gave me permission to use this oil painting as part of my cover. And I reached out to Jean Cooper, who was the editor and formatter for this book, and she's with Shortwood Press. So again, you have opportunities to do things very differently. And this was my self-published book. I wanted my children, I wanted my friends, I wanted everybody to know how I went about finding the land that my grandmother said her granddaddy had. And then the last book is The Black Homesteaders of the South. Now with this book, the focus was on an event. And the event centered around the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, if anyone could even imagine writing a book about Black homesteaders, I could tell you that this is something that's almost a dream come true. And this book consisted of 49 stories. And Dr. Shelley Murphy is a descendant of a Black homesteader, not from the South, but from Michigan. But when the word got out that there were Black homesteaders and individuals could find primary documentation to support the fact that their ancestors did own land, I said to the group, I'll tell you what, if you would agree to put your book, put your story in a book, I'll do everything I can to get support and funding for this book. And so another strategy for folks to consider is to check out and reach out to a publisher. And that is exactly what I did. I went to a publisher, and the publisher is the History Press, and they strive to work with locally connected individuals and organizations. And I submitted a proposal to the History Press stating that there were descendants of Black homesteaders that have written their stories, and some of those stories were on the National Homestead Historical Park, and that those individuals have agreed to write their stories in a book called The Black Homesteaders of the South if the History Press would agree to support this book. And they did. Now, one thing I want to tell you all, anybody who considers writing a book and going to a publisher, you probably need to think, I need to have that manuscript completed, almost completed, before I submit my proposal. This was a proposal where I said, think I could get you a 150,000 word book manuscript. They don't want a 50,000, manuscript. They said, okay, you can do that. And I said, yes, I think I could. And I have the names of all of the contributors. So all of these contributors are also the authors, folks. I give credit to every single person that has written a story in this book. So when you see that story, you also see a profile of the individual that has written that story. So this is something that I want you all to really encourage you all to do this. There's a book that should come out about all of Black revolutionary patriots. We need to see who those Black revolutionary soldiers were. Angela Walton Raji has a book, The Oklahoma Freedmen. She has also done something very similar. She has an anthology. So that's something else for you all to consider. You can do a book as a collaborating book. You can do a book as an individual and self-publish that book, or you can go to a publisher. So that's all I have to say. I look forward to additional questions from you, Shelley.
Yeah. And thank you for that. And we put this out here to give the audience that's listening and folks that have watched this webinar the opportunities. You saw self-publishing, you saw collaborative publishing, you heard who worked with the editor, who encouraged, you heard about mentors, all kinds of things. So I'm going to open it up. Brian, if you see any questions in the audience, if there's any, let's hear them. I don't see any questions. I see comments, lots of, kind of accolades and things. Do you see any questions?
There are a lot of accolades and a lot of commentary, but no kind of specific questions about publishing and writing.
Wonderful. So we have done our job. So one last question before I let everybody go. What is the one? And Donya, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to go to Darius, then Bernice, and then Brian, which he didn't know. What is the one takeaway you would like an audience person to go away with? Donya, you're on mute, so come on. Darius, you're next.
What would I want somebody to come away with?
After what you heard all today, you all have brought a lot to this table for people to think about telling those stories about your families?
The courage to do it, because it's a hard thing to do. The courage to do it, because the one thing that I didn't share was how I lost family members over this.
Mm-hmm.
So I have family members that don't talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're doing it for other reasons, if you're helping other people,
Mm-hmm.
be straightforward. Learn how to be straightforward, to explain to them, okay, this is what DNA does, and this is what it may, what you might come out and find. If you're not ready to find that kind of stuff, you do not need to do DNA. So definitely, like, understanding. I think I would want people to come to get from this is to understanding what it entails to do this. It's not for everybody, and you gotta have the huge strength and huge courage to be able to do this and to keep doing this, especially when you might lose a family member because you're telling the secret. I mean, look at what Bernice said. One person was like, leave it alone, let it go.
Right.
So you got people that's going to do that. They'd be like, why are you doing it? Why are you why are you telling our business? It's not necessarily telling the business, though. It's really, my reasoning for doing it was because I don't want my family to marry each other no daggone more. Like, I'm over that. And they didn't even know that they were marrying each other. They didn't even know that they were having children with each other. And that's because of the secrets or the hiding or so it's courage. I think I want people to courage to be able to do this. Yeah.
That's a good one. Darius, what would you like people to take away?
One thing I will leave is no one can tell your family story better than you.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so you're going to have to be that person to ignore all of the comments about why you want to research this and leave that in the past. But no one can tell your story better than you.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and that's what I was always thinking about when I was in the beginning trying to find out, well, who's going to publish my book. I didn't want to go the traditional route because I didn't want anyone saying, well, hey, you can't put that in your book, or you can't say this about your family, So I went the self-publishing route because I didn't want anyone telling me, those things. And so that's what I will leave with everyone.
All right. Bernice.
I would leave with everyone to leave a legacy. And to leave that legacy in black and white. You have probably been gathering a lot of information, and you know what you have. Sit down, organize it to tell your story. And I also like to say to people, you may think you can't write, but you can talk.
Yes.
If you can talk, you can write. You will have to decide what kind of writer you want to be. Do you want to be a very technical research writer, or do you want to just be a storyteller? Also, I would say to write, you need to read. You need to read a lot to understand what kind of writing do you like. And be yourself in your writing. Get yourself a good editor. And that editor is not going to tell you what to do, but that editor will look at your structure and help you structure your thoughts so that what you're writing can come out as concise as possible. And if you don't want to do it by yourself, do it with others. In fact, that might be the good way to start. Do it with others, and then test yourself, and then do it by yourself. But always think, what am I leaving for the next generation? And I want to just tell you a little anecdote. When our ancestors, our stories came out, my granddaughter, little kid, went to school, to my surprise, told the teacher, my grandmother's famous. And the teacher said, what? I didn't know anything about this. The teacher told me. And she said, why do you say your grandmother's famous? She said, because there's a book and her name is in it and it's about our family. And the kid, she was a little kid, but she was excited. And that's what you want. You want those people that are coming behind you to be excited that there is a story and it's real and it has documentation to support everything that's in the book. And so, but that is if you write a nonfiction. Of course, you can also do historical fiction, but have fun. I would say this shouldn't be a process that leaves you in tears, but sometimes it may. But tell your story. As Darius said, nobody can tell it as good as you. So do it. And that's why the Memory Keepers decided to call the book Our Ancestors, Our Stories, because it's us that's talking about our ancestors. Don't give your story to somebody else to write when you can write it yourself.
You just hit right on Harley Davidson's quote. And y'all know who Harley Davidson is. In other words, bottom line, what he's saying is don't let someone else hold the pen when you're telling your story. So Brian, also as an author, and you got, I would like you to share what would be the takeaway that you hope people walk away from today with.
Well, hopefully they're inspired to actually share their family history. And I've got some non-book related ways of doing it because not everyone's going to feel comfortable about writing a book. So these are some ideas that I'm going to suggest. You can start off with a blog. Very short form style of writing until you get confident in terms of writing. You can turn your blog into a website so it can be fuller. Now, if you're going to go that route, please, if you're talking about so-and-so married such and such a time period and had all of these kids, sources and citations. There are way too many family history blogs out there that don't cite their sources. I think Bernice raised that one. So I'm going to double down and emphasize that one. You can do a podcast. You can do an audio-only podcast. You can do a video podcast. Genealogy Adventures started off as a blog that turned into a website and then turned into a podcast that's now a TV show. So that's the story of what Donya and I have created over 7 years. You can create a game. You can write a play that you can do at home. Get the kids, get the younger generations involved. That way they're learning about their ancestors as they're enacting something that you really want them to know. Speak to the younger generation to get ideas about, there's all of these apps and technology and storytelling kind of tools and stuff. Speak to the younger generation, find out what's hot, what's easy to use, and what kind of fits what you want to talk about. Also, children's books. We didn't really touch on children's books. That's, for me, again, that would be another kind of amazing way to share your family history with a much younger audience. And let's face it, the kids need to know. The kids need to know.
Yes, they do. And that takes it from one generation to another. And someone mentioned earlier about leaving the legacy. Yeah. Thank you for that. Any questions before we conclude?
We have some great questions. Great. So from Rick Voigt, as professional writers, what advice would you provide to us that wish to simply write our family stories for family knowledge collection and sharing?
That's open to anybody.
I can put that on the screen if that helps. There we go.
I can start. My advice is just to start talking to everyone and understand that the information that you're going to get from that oral history, you got to prove it to be correct. It is oral history. We do, no one that ever believes that grandma's going to tell us a lie. And, nobody's ever going to want to ever think anything like that. So when you find that oral history, when you talk and you start writing that information down and collecting that information, then prove it before you write it, because you might actually be writing just what they want you to know as opposed to what actually was the story.
So you're
That's-
saying include supporting evidence and stuff.
Include supporting
Because when
evidence.
you're talking
Yes.
oral history, there might not be a document, but there could be collaborating
Right.
things and information. Great.
Right. And you might find the information that what they said, that oral history, you may find it to be true, but back it up with
Yeah.
something.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Next one, or anyone else?
Well, my advice would be to outline your story. What's the thing? I mean, where do you want to go? Because you don't want to go all over the place and people not really know what you're talking about. So I would say focus on an outline of which you can then go in and fill in the blanks, if you will.
Sure.
Right now, there are tools out there to help you. I mean, you could look at, there's certain prompts that may help you determine how you want to write it. But you also have AI now that can even help you come up with your outline. But definitely, I mean, that's my recommendation, that you outline where you want to go. So you know what your goal is. And for some people, they already know what the ending is.
Right.
And some may write the ending before they write the beginning. But you have to fill in all the meat, all the other information. And because it's nonfiction, you definitely want to be able to have your sources identified and ready to plug into the statements that you make within your book. And make it, I mean, I'm a conversational person. I like to have dialogue. You may think differently, but when you start writing, write in such a way that people want to read your book. I have a hard time reading a 500-page book, and it doesn't get interested until the middle of the book. I want you to start off with a bang and make me want to continue to read your book, or that's it, the book is gone. So that's my recommendation. And my other recommendation is write. Just start writing. Just as, you know, I want to go back to something that Brian said. Do a blog. You know, even if it means that something happened today and you went home and you start writing it, at least you have it. You know, it may mean a diary. I went back 10 years and looked at, I chronicled, I did international work for 10 years. And I wrote every single day what happened. And I forgot I did it until I pulled up my books and I said, oh my God, this is a book. But you have to start writing it down or recording it or something, or you'll forget it. And you don't want to forget it. So, you know, that's my recommendation.
I think some people, and hearing both of you say that, some people, what might help with the outline, and we're responding to what Tony Smith's question was, I work in timelines. I like my stuff to be in order. So if you either take a college class from me or it's a genealogy class, it's going to follow some sort of a timeline. That's how I organize, but that's also the only math I can handle in this brain is to see something in order. So I can't hop from 1860 and then go to 1920. I got to take it 1870, 1880, and it keeps me organized too and focused. So Darius, do you have anything to add to this?
Responding to Tony Smith,
yes.
Question. Yes, I do recommend that you do write with an outline.
Great.
In the very beginning, I did write down what each of my chapters should look like. I didn't get too technical, but, you know, just basically guiding me so that I don't get, putting the wrong stuff in the wrong area. And there was something else I was supposed to say. Lost my train of thought.
Well, I'm also going to say an outline saved my bacon because I was given this was done to me by a publisher. I had just under 12 weeks to write 2 how-to research books. And if I couldn't have done that without an outline, which even included word limits in each one of those chapters. So that just kept me really focused. I also set up my daily schedule so that I would have my workout routine at a certain time, and I would have my writing time, and then my admin time. You know, because
Mhm.
we're all busy people. You know, the modern era, we're all juggling multiple kind of tasks and obligations and balls. That's what kept me on task. Also, even learning what time of day, if you're going to go the writing route, what time of day works best for you. For me, I wrote best in the morning.
Yeah,
Whatever, it was like I had a
good point.
mental word limit. So I'd always do my writing in the morning and I would do my editing in the afternoon.
Mhm.
I
At least for me.
also recommend that you get an accountability partner. This is
Oh,
somebody, this is somebody that
yes.
might do a little gentle pushing. And I know my second book, I had an accountability partner. And she got so into the book that if she didn't get a chapter the next day, she was blowing up my phone. But you
I'm
sometimes
experiencing that right now.
sometimes you need somebody
Yes.
there that's gently helping you along
Yeah.
the way, because there are points in the writing process where you may feel you have a block and you
Yeah.
want to stop it. And sometimes you may have to stop it, but you have that accountability partner there
Sure.
to say, well, what's going on? Well, can you tell me what happened next? Just tell me. And by the time you get to the point where you telling them what happened next, your writing block is gone. You're
Yeah.
writing again.
Yes.
I also want to, ditto what Brian said about finding the time of day. I found that early in the morning, I was together. My brain was ready. All during the day, I might think about it, but if I wake up I'll dream about the next part to my
Yes.
book
Yes.
and have it all in my head. And I might sit down and just dictate it. But the important thing is to find a time a day that works for you.
Thank you all for that. And I'm going to ditto that because mine is like 6:30 to 8:30. Then the research starts 9 to 1. And so I'm focused. So appreciate you all. It's been wonderful. Lots of tips and things you have shared. I'm sorry, Brian, you
I've
talking to
got
me?
I've got one more
Oh, go
pointer.
ahead.
Or the people who are listening, who are watching the presentation and will watch this on demand,
Yeah.
don't sit and think, well, who would want to read about my family history?
Mm,
We're living in a really interesting time. What I'm personally finding is that as some states are making it difficult to read Black stories and Black histories, there is a real interest in accessing those kind of
mm.
stories and engaging with those kind of stories and reading those kinds of stories. And I'm going to say that there probably, I know that there have always been Black writers. I just keep thinking about that group, that large group of African American writers that came out of the Civil War, that period
Mhm.
during Reconstruction. There was a blossoming. There were Black publishers. There were Black authors of every description, young, old, men, women. And then during Jim Crow, that seems to have died off. There were still Black publishers. I mean, we had James Baldwin, for
Sure.
instance, and that whole kind of generation. But then I don't think people were kind of engaging with Black writers the way that I guess when you start making something forbidden or difficult to access,
Yeah.
people all of a sudden become interested in, what are you trying to hide from me? So
Mhm.
don't think that anyone who's contemplating kind of turning their family history into a book or some sort of written form or entertainment form, don't think that your ancestors are boring. We keep saying on genealogy adventures, your ancestor could have find the strength to get out of bed,
Yeah.
put their shoes on, get out there and face the day knowing the obstacles that they were going to have to face, and they went out there and did it, and they put a roof over their family's head, clothes on their backs, and food on the table. They did it. They did what they had to do to keep things moving. And people may find that an inspirational story and a very relatable story. Not
Mhm.
all of us have towering figures of ancestors.
Sure.
Some of us have very humble, very modest ancestors, but you know what? They kept it moving, they faced adversity, and they did what they had to do.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
that's worth recognizing and sharing.
And they were humans before they were property. And
Yes,
they
they
have
were.
names. And
That's
so
right.
it is time for all of us to start writing, sharing those names, get the genealogy buddy, get the genealogy writing buddy, and so forth. And again, yes, Nikio, excellent. We have to be the beacons of our own history. It's on us. So again, I want to thank you. Thank you to Brian, Donya, Bernice, and Darius. I think it's been well informed for the attendees. So appreciate all of you and see y'all in June for the next topic on the third Saturday in June. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, but just think about it and just think about the Caribbean and doing research about the West Indies and this, that, and other. So again, have a great Saturday. Enjoy. And thank you again. Appreciate it.
I'm going to play us out.